The car sat in the middle of the showroom floor, like an embarrassment someone had forgotten to remove. It was a 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, and it had not run in 11 years. The paint had oxidized to a flat, chalky gray. The chrome trim pitted and filmed with the particular rust that forms when metal is stored indoors, but never truly protected. The rear quarter panel carried a crease the length of a forearm. The interior smelled of mildew and old leather and something else underneath. The faint, acrid trace of an electrical fire, long extinguished, never explained. Vivian Hartwell, the CEO of Hartwell Prestige Group, looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided to stop thinking about. She was 46, tailored in a charcoal blazer that had been cut to her specific measurements, and she had built her company on the premise that some things could not be saved, only replaced. She said it plainly, to the room, to no one in particular, the way people say things when they want them repeated later. "That car is a monument to wasted money," she said. "Whoever touches it next deserves whatever they get." She did not know who was standing 12 feet behind her. The man in the gray coveralls was named Daniel Voss. He was 38 years old, and he had driven 40 minutes in a truck with a cracked windshield to look at a car that everyone else had already given up on. He did not have a website. He did not advertise. What Vivian Hartwell did not know was that before the coveralls, before the small shop on Mercer Road, Daniel Voss had spent 9 years as the lead restoration engineer at Royce Heritage Works in Coventry, the only independent atelier in the world authorized by Rolls-Royce motor cars to perform factory-equivalent concours restorations. He had held 2 patents on refinishing compounds. He had rebuilt cars for a sitting prime minister and a museum in Geneva. He had walked away from all of it the year Claire died, because their daughter needed a father who came home. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. Daniel stood still in the showroom, and he looked at the silver shadow, the way a doctor looks at a patient. Not at the surface, but through it. He did not touch the car yet. He simply looked. His name was not announced. Nobody introduced him. He was simply there, the way quiet people are simply there. And the room moved around him without noticing. He had a daughter named Maisie, who was 7 years old and carried a small stuffed rabbit named Button everywhere she went. Button had one ear that had been repaired so many times with different thread that it was now a patchwork of colors, white, then yellow, then a dark green, from the spool Daniel kept in the shop. Maisie had watched him repair it each time, with the same serious expression she brought to most things, and once, when he had finished the last stitch, she had looked at the ear and said, "It's better now because you can see all the times it was fixed." Daniel had not known what to say to that. He had simply agreed. The shop on Mercer Road was called Voss Automotive. It had no sign beyond the address, numbers, no social media presence, no listing in any directory that a person would find without already knowing to look. It occupied a converted machine shop with high ceilings and poured concrete floors and a single pegboard wall where tools hung in their outlines. Each one returned to exactly the same place after every use. The fluorescent lights were good ones, the kind that rendered color accurately, which mattered more than most people understood. Daniel had moved back to Mill Haven after Claire's funeral because her parents were there and because Maisie needed people around her who remembered her mother. He had taken the machine shop lease on a Tuesday and opened for business on the Thursday following. And in the first 3 months, he had fixed 14 cars that other shops had declined to touch. He charged fairly. He explained nothing that wasn't asked. He did the work and he went home. And on the nights Maisie had trouble sleeping, he sat on the edge of her bed and told her about engines, the way other fathers told fairy tales, not because he thought it would help, but because it was honest, and she seemed to know the difference. He had been at the shop for 2 years when the call came about the Silver Shadow. A man named Gerald Fitch had called on a Wednesday afternoon. Gerald was the facilities manager at Hartwell Prestige Group, and he had found Daniel's name in a handwritten note tucked inside a service manual he had pulled from the car's glove box. A note left there, apparently, by a mechanic who had looked at the car 8 years ago and decided it was beyond him. The note said simply, "If you ever want this done right, call Voss." Gerald had not known who Voss was. He had searched the name for 20 minutes before finding a phone number attached to a business registration in Mill Haven County. He had called expecting nothing in particular. Daniel had listened to Gerald's description of the car without interrupting. He asked 3 questions. He said he would come and look at it. He did not ask about the fee. The Silver Shadow had been acquired by Vivian Hartwell's company as part of a portfolio purchase, a collection of assets from a dissolved estate bought in bulk at a figure that made the individual pieces essentially free. The car was, in accounting terms, worth nothing. It appeared on the company's asset register at a value of $1, which was the minimum the system allowed. Vivian had seen it twice. The first time she had ordered it moved out of the main building. The second time, when the move had not happened, she had said what she said, the monument to wasted money line, and walked away. She had not been in the showroom when Daniel arrived. Gerald had let him in through the side entrance and stood back while Daniel walked around the car once, slowly, in the particular way that people who have spent years looking at things learn to walk around them, not circling exactly, but reading. The way you read a page by moving your eyes across it in a specific order that isn't random even when it looks like it is. Daniel crouched beside the rear quarter panel and looked at the crease. He ran 2 fingers along it without pressing. He stood up and opened the driver's door and leaned in. And the smell of mildew and old leather and the ghost of the electrical fire came out at him all at once, and he held it in his mind the way a diagnostician holds a symptom. He straightened up and looked at Gerald. "Who told her it couldn't be fixed?" he asked. Gerald named a dealership in the city. Daniel nodded once, the way a person nods when they have confirmed something they already suspected. "It can be fixed," Daniel said. "Most of it in a day. The electrical fault in about 5 minutes once I find it." Gerald blinked. 5 minutes. "If it's what I think it is," Daniel said. "It usually is." He did not elaborate. He pulled a small flashlight from his breast pocket and leaned back into the car. And the beam moved slowly along the underside of the dashboard in the particular unhurried way that told Gerald, without any words being used, that this was a man who had done this before, not once or twice, but hundreds of times, in rooms far more demanding than this one. Gerald stood in the quiet of the showroom and watched. He did not know, standing there, that he was watching the beginning of something. He thought he was watching a mechanic look at a car. He was watching something else entirely. It was a Tuesday in October when Daniel brought Maisie with him to the showroom for the initial assessment, because her school had a half day and he had not been able to arrange anything else. She sat on a folding chair Gerald had produced from a supply closet, button tucked under one arm, and she watched her father move around the car with the same focused attention she gave to most things. At one point, she asked Gerald what color the car was supposed to be. Gerald said he wasn't sure. Silver, probably, given the name. Maisie looked at the chalky, oxidized surface and said, "It doesn't look like silver. It looks like something forgot to be silver." Gerald had laughed, a short, surprised sound. Maisie had not been joking. Daniel finished his assessment and stood at the front of the car for a long moment, one hand resting flat on the hood. The metal was cold through his palm. He could feel, or imagined he could feel, the particular density of the steel beneath the layers of failed paint, the weight of a thing that had been built to last and had simply been left. "I'll take it," he said. Gerald looked at him. "You mean you'll take the job?" "Yeah," Daniel said. He picked up his flashlight and put it back in his pocket. "Same thing." He looked at Maisie. She was already sliding off the chair, button repositioned under her other arm, ready to go. The truck with the cracked windshield pulled out of the Hartwell Prestige Group parking lot at 3:47 in the afternoon, and Gerald stood in the doorway and watched it go. He had not yet told Vivian that someone was coming for the car. He was not sure exactly why he had hesitated. Something about the way the man had looked at it, not with enthusiasm, not with the particular brightness that people get when they think they're going to make money. Something quieter than that, something that felt, to Gerald, like recognition. He went back inside and wrote Daniel Voss's name in his notebook. Then he looked it up again, more carefully this time, and this time he found something the first search had missed. A trade journal article from 8 years ago, published in a British automotive quarterly, about a restoration atelier in Coventry that had returned a 1958 Silver Wraith to factory specification for the first time in the car's documented history. The lead engineer was named in the article. His photograph showed a younger man, clean-shaven, standing beside the finished car in a workshop that looked nothing like a converted machine shop in Millhaven. Gerald read the article twice. Then he closed his notebook and did not say anything to Vivian that evening, because he had not been asked, and because he was beginning to understand that this was going to be a different kind of situation than it had appeared to be at the start. He was correct about that. The Silver Shadow arrived at Voss Automotive on a flatbed truck on a Thursday morning, and Daniel was already there when it came. Had been there since 6. The shop lit and warm. The pegboard tools in their places. A pot of coffee going on the workbench. Maisie was at school. The morning was cold and still. The kind of cold that makes sound carry farther than it should. And Daniel could hear the flatbed's diesel engine from 2 blocks away before he saw the headlights. He watched the car come down off the ramp the way you watch something being returned to you that was never yours to begin with, carefully and without sentiment. The driver asked him to sign the delivery sheet. Daniel signed it. The driver left. The Silver Shadow sat in the center of the shop floor under the fluorescent lights, and now the color rendering mattered, because in this light Daniel could see things the showroom's ambient fixtures had softened. The oxidation was worse on the passenger side. The chrome on the rear bumper had not merely pitted. It had begun to lift in 3 places, the plating separating from vinyl substrate in the way chrome does when water has found its way behind it and frozen there, season after season, expanding and contracting until the bond fails. The crease in the rear quarter panel was shallower than it had looked in the showroom, which was good. The paint beneath the oxidation, where Daniel scraped a thumbnail across a test patch near the fuel filler cap, was intact, faded, dull, but intact. He stood back and looked at the car for a full 2 minutes without moving. Then he went to the pegboard and took down the first tool he would need, and he began. The work began in earnest on day 1, which was a Friday, and it began the way Daniel's work always began, not with urgency, but with inventory. He moved around the Silver Shadow with a clipboard and a pen and a methodical patience that was not performance but habit, the kind of habit that forms over years of being the person in the room who has to know exactly what is wrong before anyone else is allowed to touch anything. He noted the chrome separation on the rear bumper at 3 locations, each one measured with a steel rule and recorded to the nearest millimeter. He noted the oxidation gradient, heavier on the passenger side, which told him the car had been stored with that side facing a window or a vent, exposed to light and moisture cycling, that the driver's side had been spared. He noted the crease in the rear quarter panel, which in the better light of the shop he could now see was not a single impact, but 2. One older, one newer, the metal having been pushed and then pushed again, possibly years apart, by different forces at different angles. He wrote all of this down. He did not photograph it. He had learned in Coventry that photographs flattened what hands and eyes understood in 3 dimensions, and that the discipline of writing a thing down forced a precision that clicking a shutter did not. On day 2, he found the electrical fault. It took him 4 minutes and 30 seconds, not 5 minutes, which was close enough that he did not feel the need to revise his estimate. The fault was a corroded splice in the positive feed to the dashboard lighting circuit, a repair made at some point in the car's history by someone who had used the wrong gauge wire and sealed it with electrical tape that had, over 11 years of temperature cycling, contracted and cracked and admitted enough moisture to oxidize the connection to a near open state. The splice was behind the lower dash panel, accessible only if you knew to remove a specific trim piece that was held by 3 screws whose heads were hidden behind the carpet edge. Daniel removed the trim piece, identified the splice, cut it out, and replaced it with a properly rated connector, heat shrink tubing. He restored the trim piece. He turned the key. The dashboard lights came on. They were the amber gold color of old instruments, and they glowed steadily, without flicker. And Daniel looked at them for a moment, the way you look at something that has returned from a long absence, not with surprise, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. He wrote the time in his notebook, 9:14 a.m. He did not call anyone to report this. He went back to the pegboard and took down the next tool. By day 6, he had stripped the exterior chrome and sent all 14 pieces to a plating shop in Dayton, run by a man named Roy Sutter, who was 67 years old and had been doing triple chrome plating since before Daniel was born. Roy did not need to be told what the pieces were from. He looked at the Rolls-Royce script on the trunk badge and said, "I'll call you when they're done." He did not ask about the timeline. He did not ask about the fee. He said he would come. He did. On day 9, a man named Pete Calloway arrived at the shop at 7 in the morning with a bag of tools and a thermos of coffee, and he did not knock. He simply came in through the side door, the way people do when they have been somewhere many times before. Pete was 44, a former body technician who had worked for 3 years at a Jaguar Heritage facility in the UK before returning to Ohio for reasons he had never fully explained to Daniel, and that Daniel had never fully asked about. He had a way with sheet metal that Daniel respected completely, which was the only credential that mattered in the shop on Mercer Road. Pete set his thermos on the workbench and walked to the rear quarter panel and put his hand flat on it, feeling the crease the way a doctor palpates a joint. Not pressing, reading. He stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, 2 events. Daniel said, yes. Pete said, older one first. Daniel said, yes. That was the entire conversation. Pete opened his bag and began. Maisie came to the shop on day 11, a Saturday, and sat at the folding table near the pegboard with her homework and button. She watched Pete work the metal with a slapper and a dolly, the sound of it a rhythmic, hollow percussion that filled the shop with something between music and machinery. After a while, she looked up from her homework and said, with complete seriousness, "Is that how you fix a dent? You talk to it?" Pete, who had not been talked to by a 7-year-old in some time, paused and considered this. He said, "You have to find out where it wants to go." Maisie looked at the panel, then back at Pete. "It wants to go flat," she said. Pete looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his notebook. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to improve on. By day 14, the rear quarter panel was flat. Not approximately flat. Not flat enough. Flat within 0.2 of a millimeter across the entire repaired area, which Pete confirmed with a straight edge and which Daniel confirmed with his palm, running it slowly across the surface in the unhurried way of a person who has learned to trust his hands over his eyes when the two disagree. Pete packed his tools on day 15 and left without ceremony, the way he had arrived. He refused payment twice. On the third offer, he accepted a figure that was approximately a third of what his time was worth, and he left without discussing it further. Daniel wrote the amount in his ledger and noted it as a debt he would not be permitted to repay directly, but would repay in kind in some future way when the opportunity presented itself. That was how things worked between them. It always had been. The work continued. On day 18, Daniel began the paint process, and this was the part of the restoration that most people, had they been watching, would have failed to understand. The Silver Shadow's original color was not silver. It was a Rolls-Royce factory color designated silver sand, a specific formulation from 1965 that had a warm undertone, almost ivory at certain angles, almost gray at others, that was distinct from the flat silver that most people assumed when they heard the name. Daniel had confirmed the color code from the chassis plate on the first day. He had sourced the base formulation from a supplier in the UK who still maintained the original factory paint records, and he had mixed the top coat himself in the shop, adjusting the tint ratio by small increments and spraying test cards under the fluorescent lights until the color matched a reference chip he had pulled from a protected area of the car's door jamb, a place where the original paint had survived beneath a rubber seal, undisturbed and unfaded, for 59 years. He sprayed the car in stages, allowing each coat to cure fully before the next, working in the particular unhurried rhythm that the process demanded, and that could not be accelerated without consequence. On day 22, between coats, he sat at the workbench with a cup of coffee and looked at the car in its intermediate state, primer showing in places, color in others, the surface not yet level. And he thought about Claire, the way he sometimes did in quiet moments, not with grief exactly, but with the factual acknowledgement of her absence, the way you acknowledge a load-bearing wall that is no longer there and build accordingly. She had liked old things. She had liked the idea that something could be returned to what it was. He thought she would have found the silver shadow interesting, and he held that thought for a moment and then set it aside and went back to work. The chrome returned from Roy Sutter's shop on day 24, wrapped in tissue and packed in individual foam-lined trays, each piece triple-plated and polished to a depth that made the shop lights bend in the curves of the metal. Daniel unwrapped each piece and inspected it under a loupe, and every piece was correct. Roy had charged him fairly. Daniel paid the invoice the same day. On day 26, at 11:47 in the morning, Daniel fitted the last piece of chrome, the Rolls-Royce Spirit of Ecstasy mascot, replated and remounted on a new stainless base, and stepped back from the car. The silver shadow stood in the center of the shop floor under the fluorescent lights, and it was not the car that had arrived on the flatbed. It was the car that the car had always been, underneath. The paint was the correct color. The chrome was the correct depth. The interior, which Daniel had spent days 11 through 16 cleaning and conditioning and restitching in two places where the leather had cracked along seam lines, smelled of leather and lanolin and nothing else. He started the engine. It turned over on the second attempt. The fuel system had needed flushing, a job he had done on day 3. And it settled into the particular idle that a 6.2-liter V8 from 1965 settles into when it has been properly attended to. Not loud, not rough, but deep and even. A sound with substance behind it, the kind of sound that registers in the chest before it registers in the ears. Daniel listened to it for 2 minutes. Then he shut it off and wrote the time in his notebook. The car was done. He called Gerald Fitch that afternoon and said the car was ready. Gerald asked when Vivian could come to see it. Daniel said any time after Thursday. Gerald said he would arrange it and asked if there was anything Daniel needed before then. Daniel said no. Gerald started to say something else and then didn't, and the call ended. That evening, Daniel picked Maisie up from her grandmother's house, and they drove home in the truck with the cracked windshield. And Maisie asked if the car was finished, and Daniel said it was. She thought about this for a moment and then said, "Is it silver now?" He said yes. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been tracking for some time. "Good," she said. It was trying to be. She put Button on her lap and looked out the window at the passing streetlights, and Daniel drove. And the truck was quiet, and the night outside was cold and still. He did not know on driving home what the next week would bring. He knew the car was correct. That was enough. On the Thursday, Vivian Hartwell came to Voss Automotive. She brought 2 people with her, a man named Clifton Reeves, who was the director of asset management at Hartwell Prestige Group, and who had a way of standing in rooms that communicated without any words that he considered most rooms beneath him, and a woman named Sasha Lind, who was Vivian's personal assistant and who had, over the course of the past 3 weeks, quietly assembled a file on Daniel Voss that she had not been asked to assemble and had not yet shared with anyone. The file included the trade journal article Gerald had found, and also a citation in a Rolls-Royce motor car's technical bulletin from 2019, and also a letter published in the Journal of Automotive Conservation, in which Daniel's name appeared in the acknowledgments of a paper on pre-1970 Rolls-Royce paint formulation recovery. Sasha had read all of it. She had said nothing. Vivian arrived at 9 in the morning, precisely on time, in a car that was new and leased and worth considerably more than the Silver Shadow had appeared to be worth 3 weeks ago. She wore the charcoal blazer again, or one identical to it. She stepped into the shop and stopped. The Silver Shadow was parked in the center of the floor, as it had been when it arrived, but it was not the same car. The light fell across the Rolls-Royce silver sand paint and moved in it the way light moves in a surface that has reflected off, but caught and held and returned, slightly changed. The chrome carried the shop's fluorescent tubes in long, clean curves. The spirit of ecstasy on the hood stood upright and still and exact. Clifton Reeves looked at the car and said nothing. Vivian looked at the car and said nothing. Sasha Lynn looked at the car and then looked at Daniel, who was standing to one side with his hands in his pockets, and she recognized the expression on his face. Not pride, not expectation, but the neutral, unhurried look of a person waiting for something that is not urgent. Vivian walked slowly around the car. She did not touch it. She stopped at the rear quarter panel and looked at the place where the crease had been. And she looked for a long time, and there was nothing to see. The metal was continuous. The paint was continuous. The crease was gone, not in the way that things are covered, but in the way that things are corrected completely and without remainder. She stood at the front of the car and looked at the spirit of ecstasy for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel. "I said something when I first saw this car," she said. The register of her voice was different from the showroom, quieter, more considered. "At the auction. It was unkind." She paused. "It was also wrong." She did not look away. "I'd like to discuss what an ongoing relationship might look like between your shop and our group, formally." She said it the way people say things when they mean them precisely, without ornament. Daniel looked at her for a moment. "I'll think about it," he said. He said it without edge, without hesitation. It was simply the accurate answer. Clifton Reeves, who had not spoken since entering the shop, turned and walked back toward the door. He did not shake anyone's hand. He did not look at the car again. He left and the door closed behind him, and the shop was quieter for it. Sasha Lind paused beside Daniel on her way out and said quietly that she had read the article from Coventry. Daniel looked at her. She nodded once, the way people nod when they are not asking for a response, and followed Vivian out. Gerald Fitch stayed behind. He stood beside the car for a while, looking at it, and then he said, "I knew it would be something." Daniel said, "You found the note." Gerald said, "I found the note." They stood in the quiet of the shop, and the silver shadow stood between them. Silver now, correctly and completely silver. And the fluorescent lights held everything in their clean, accurate rendering. Gerald left at 10:30. Daniel locked the shop at noon because Maisie had a half day, and he was going to pick her up. He drove home in the truck with the cracked windshield, and the afternoon light came through the crack at an angle that made a thin line of brightness across the dashboard, and he drove through it, and the town was quiet, and the road was straight, and there was nothing urgent ahead of him that he could not handle. That evening, after dinner, Maisie fell asleep at the kitchen table over drawings she had been making. A car, rendered in silver crayon, with what appeared to be a small figure standing on the hood. Daniel carried her to bed and set Button beside her on the pillow. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, in the light from the hall, and she was still, and the room was still. And outside the window, the garage light was on, casting its rectangle across the driveway, the way it always did, steady and unhurried, the same as every night. He went back to the kitchen and finished his coffee. The drawing was still on the table. The silver crayon had caught the overhead light and held it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The drawing stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days before Daniel moved it. He had not meant to leave it there. He had simply kept finding other things to do when he passed it. Coffee to pour, a dish to rinse, Maisie's lunchbox to pack. And each time he passed it, he looked at it briefly. The silver crayon figure standing on the silver crayon hood, and he left it where it was. On the 4th morning, he put it on top of the refrigerator, where the light from the window would not fade it. Maisie noticed immediately. She asked if he was keeping it. He said yes. She considered this with the same serious expression she brought to most things. And then she said, "Because it's good?" He said, "Because it's accurate." She thought about that for a moment, and then she nodded and went to find Button, and the subject was closed. The call from Gerald came on a Friday, 10 days after Vivian's visit. A formal letter of engagement had been drafted by Hartwell Prestige Group's legal department. Daniel read it twice, set it on the workbench, and went back to the car he was already working on, a 1971 Jaguar E-Type that had come in the day before. Brought by a retired school teacher who had owned it since new, and who had simply run out of mechanics willing to try. Daniel had told her it would take time. She had said she had time. That was how it started. He did not think of himself as a man who had proved something. He had done the work, and the work had been correct. And that was the whole of it. The silver shadow was gone. Transported back to Hartwell's facility on a flatbed the same way it had come. And the shop floor held a different car now. And the pegboard held the same tools in the same places. And the fluorescent lights rendered everything accurately as they always had. That evening, he picked Maisie up, and they drove home through the early dark, and she fell asleep in the truck before they reached the house, button tucked against her side. He carried her in and set her down and stood in the doorway the way he had stood in it before and would stand in it again. And outside the window, the garage light was on, steady and unhurried, casting its rectangle across the driveway in the cold November air. Some things are missed because no one looks long enough. Some things are returned because someone does. He turned off the hall light and left the garage light burning.